A 6-year-old boy sat frozen in the center of New York's most exclusive restaurant, his hands clamped over his ears, screaming a sound he couldn't hear himself make. His father, Pablo Costello, the man who controlled every smuggling route from Newark to the Atlantic, had his hand raised in the air, not to comfort, to strike. The entire dining room held its breath. Millionaires, politicians, men who'd ordered executions over dessert, all of them watched as the most feared crime lord in the tri-state area prepared to hit his own child in public. Then a waitress nobody had noticed before stepped between them. She didn't flinch, she didn't apologize. She reached into her apron and pulled out a strange silver object that looked like a two-pronged fork. What she did next didn't just stop Pablo Costello's hand, it shattered everything he thought he knew about his son, about power, and about the one weapon that could bring a man like him to his knees. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room isn't a gun, it's the truth.
Nancy is about to risk her life for a boy she doesn't know. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a story that leaves you speechless. And let's see how the Don reacts. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Gabriella's, an Italian restaurant in Midtown Manhattan where a single table cost more than most people's monthly rent. The air inside smelled of saffron risotto, aged leather, and quiet desperation. Nancy Walsh smoothed down her black apron for the third time in as many minutes, trying to steady her breathing. She'd been working at Gabriella's for exactly 19 days, long enough to learn which fork went where. Long enough to know that when Kevin Thornton, the restaurant manager, started sweating through his designer shirt, it meant trouble was walking through the door. Nancy, Kevin grabbed her elbow, his grip tight enough to leave marks. Table 7, you're covering it tonight. Nancy's stomach dropped like an elevator with cut cables. Table 7 isn't just a table. You serve food there. You don't make eye contact. You don't ask questions. You certainly don't mess up. Table 7 belonged to Pablo Costello, head of the Costello crime family, a man who allegedly owned half the construction contracts in Queens and all the right people in City Hall. Word was he'd once had a man's entire family deported for serving him lukewarm coffee. "I thought Marcus was on table 7, Nancy whispered, glancing at the senior waiter who was currently hiding behind a wine rack, suddenly very interested in a 2009 Barolo. Marcus called in sick. Kevin's voice cracked slightly. "You're all I've got. Just pour the water, take the order, keep your head down, and for God's sakes don't stare at the boy." Nancy frowned. "The boy?" "His son." Kevin wiped his forehead with a cloth napkin. "Vito, the kid's got problems. Just ignore him and you'll be fine." Before Nancy could ask what kind of problems, the brass-framed entrance doors swung open. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking of crystal, the murmur of deal-making, died instantly. It was like someone had pulled the plug on the entire room.
Pablo Costello walked in. He was shorter than Nancy expected from the news photos, maybe 5'10", but he moved like a man who took up all the space in any room he entered. His suit was charcoal gray and probably cost more than her car. His face was all sharp angles and calculating eyes, the kind of eyes that assessed threats before most people finished saying hello. 2 men flanked him, both built like refrigerators in tailored jackets. But Nancy's attention went to the small figure trailing behind Pablo's confident stride. A boy, no older than 6 or 7, wearing a miniature version of his father's suit. His dark hair was combed back too severely for a child, making him look like a tiny businessman. His eyes were wide, darting around the room, and his hands were pressed flat against his thighs, fingers twitching. He wasn't walking with the swagger of a mob prince. He was stumbling, struggling to keep up, and he kept glancing up at the chandelier overhead as if it might fall on him. Pablo reached table 7 and sat down without waiting for anyone to pull out his chair. The The bodyguards took positions at the entrance and near the kitchen. The boy, Vito, stood next to his chair, staring at the white tablecloth. "Sit." Pablo's voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made Nancy's bones ache. Vito didn't sit. He was fixated on the pattern of the cloth, his small fingers reaching out to trace the embroidered edges. "Vito!" Pablo snapped his fingers twice, sharp as gunshots. The boy flinched violently and scrambled into his seat. He kept his head down, his hands now gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles went white. Nancy took a breath, grabbed a crystal water pitcher, and walked toward the table. "Just pour the water, don't make eye contact, get out." "Good evening, sir." Nancy's voice came out steadier than she felt. Still or sparkling? Pablo didn't look up from the menu. Still, room temperature. Nancy poured his water with surgical precision, watching the level rise in the glass. She moved to Vito's side. As she tipped the pitcher, Vito's head snapped up. He wasn't looking at her face, he was looking at the stream of water hitting the glass. His eyes followed the ripples in the liquid, mesmerized. Slowly, he reached out one small hand and placed his fingertips against the base of the glass. The vibration. He was feeling the vibration of the water hitting the crystal. "Take your hand off the glass." Pablo's voice was sharp as a blade. Vito didn't move. He kept his fingers there, his head tilted as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. Pablo reached across the table and grabbed Vito's wrist, yanking it away. "I said stop. Act like you have sense. Act like a Costello, not some—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the insult hung in the air like smoke. Nancy froze, the pitcher still in her hand. She knew that look in Vito's eyes. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't misbehavior. It was sensory seeking. The words came out before Nancy could stop them. "He likes the vibration." Pablo's head turned slowly, his eyes locked onto Nancy's. The restaurant seemed to tilt sideways. Kevin, watching from across the room, looked like he might pass out. "What did you say?" Pablo's voice was lethally quiet. Nancy swallowed hard, her heart hammering. "The water, sir. When it hits the glass, it creates a vibration. He can feel it through the crystal. It's calming for him." Pablo stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. "My son is deaf, miss. Completely deaf. He hears nothing. He understands nothing. He lives in a world of silence because his ears don't work. So don't presume to tell me what he feels." Nancy felt a flash of heat rise up her neck, but it wasn't fear. It was anger. She looked at Vito. The boy had pulled his hands into his lap and was rocking slightly, his eyes glazed over. He'd shut down. He wasn't broken. She could see the intelligence trapped behind those dark eyes, screaming to get out. "Of course, sir. My apologies." Nancy set the pitcher down and retreated to the kitchen. "You have a death wish," Kevin hissed as she pushed through the swinging doors. "I told you to ignore the boy. Pablo Costello has spent a fortune on specialists. If he says the kid's a lost cause, the kid's a lost cause. You're a waitress, Nancy, not a doctor." Nancy leaned against the stainless steel prep counter, closing her eyes. She wasn't just a waitress. Not really. 4 years ago, she'd been 2 semesters away from a degree in speech pathology at NYU. Then her younger brother Ryan was born premature with severe hearing loss. Then her mother got sick. Then the medical bills piled up. Then she'd had to drop out and start slinging pasta to people who didn't see her as human. "I'm taking their order," Nancy said, pushing off the counter. "Send someone else." "There is no one else." Nancy grabbed her notepad and walked back out. By the time the appetizers arrived, the tension at table 7 was suffocating. Pablo was on his phone, barking orders in rapid Italian to someone named Luca. Vito was alone with a plate of calamari he hadn't touched. The restaurant had filled up, the noise level rising. Conversations, laughter, the clink of silverware. For a hearing person, it was background noise. For Vito, Nancy realized, it was chaos. He couldn't filter it.
He could feel the vibrations of footsteps through the floor, the bass notes of the background music thumping through the table, the clatter of dishes rattling his bones. He had no context for any of it. Nancy watched from the server station. Vito started rocking in his chair, a slow, rhythmic motion. It was subtle at first, self-soothing. Pablo hung up the phone. He saw the rocking. His jaw tightened. Vito, enough. The boy didn't stop. He couldn't hear his father.
Pablo slammed his hand on the table. The silverware jumped. The entire restaurant went silent again. Vito, stop it, now. Vito didn't hear the words, but he felt the violent slam reverberate through the table, into his hands. He saw the fury on his father's face. Panic flooded his features. He didn't understand why his father was angry. He'd just been trying to calm the storm inside his body. Vito stood up on his chair, his small frame trembling, and let out a high-pitched guttural cry. It was the sound of a deaf child who couldn't regulate his own volume. It was raw, desperate, and heartbreaking. "Sit down." Pablo stood, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage. He grabbed Vito's arm. Vito yanked back, knocking over his water glass. The crystal shattered on the marble floor. The crash echoed through the restaurant. Pablo raised his hand. "Don't." The voice wasn't one of the bodyguards. It was Nancy. She crossed the dining room in 5 strides, ignoring the gasps of the other diners. She stepped directly between Pablo Costello and his son. Pablo froze, his hand raised mid-air. He looked at Nancy like she was an hallucination. "Move, before I have you removed." "He's not misbehaving." Nancy's voice shook, but her feet stayed planted. "He's overwhelmed. He can't hear the music, but he can feel the bass vibrating through the floor, and it's terrifying him. Look at him." Pablo glanced at his son. Vito was gasping for air, tears streaming down his face, clutching at his chest. "He doesn't need discipline, Mr. Costello," Nancy said quietly. "He needs to know you're there." Pablo's face darkened. "He needs to learn control. He needs this." Nancy turned her back on the most dangerous man in New York and knelt in front of Vito. She didn't try to grab him or restrain him. She reached into her apron pocket. Every bodyguard in the room tensed, hands moving toward concealed weapons. Kevin shrieked from the back. But Nancy didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out a small velvet pouch. She opened it and removed a tuning fork. It was medical grade, made of surgical steel, with a weighted end designed for bone conduction testing. Pablo stared, confused. "What the hell is that?" Nancy ignored him. She struck the tuning fork hard against the edge of the table. The metal prongs blurred with vibration, emitting a pure, sustained note. Nancy held the base of the fork up. Vito, still crying, flinched away. Nancy moved slowly, gently pressing the vibrating stem against Vito's collarbone. The effect was instant. Vito gasped. His eyes went wide. The crying stopped immediately. The strong, pure frequency vibrated through his bones, bypassing his damaged ears entirely and resonating directly in his skull. For a boy living in a world of muffled, chaotic sensation, this was a clear, singular, beautiful note. Nancy struck the fork again and placed it against Vito's elbow. Vito laughed. It was a rusty, unpracticed sound, but it was real. He reached out with trembling fingers and touched the fork, feeling the hum in his fingertips. Nancy smiled, blinking back tears. She struck the fork once more and placed the stem against the wooden table. She gestured for Vito to put his hand on the wood. Vito placed his small palm flat on the surface. He felt the vibration travel through the grain. His face transformed. He looked up at Nancy, his dark eyes shining with an intelligence that had been locked away for 6 years. He tapped the table, then tapped his chest. "I feel it." Nancy lifted her hands. She didn't use formal sign language. She touched her chin, then moved her hand toward him. "Thank you." Vito clumsily copied the gesture. The silence in the restaurant was total, but this time it wasn't fear, it was awe. Nancy stood slowly and turned to face Pablo. The crime lord was pale, all the color drained from his face. He was staring at his son, who was now calm, tracing patterns on the table, waiting for the next vibration. "He's not broken, Mr. Costello," Nancy said softly. "He just experiences the world differently. You've been trying to force sound into his ears. You should have been putting it in his hands." Pablo looked from his son to the cheap tuning fork in Nancy's hand. He looked at Nancy, really looked at her. "Who are you?" "I'm Nancy Walsh, just a waitress." Pablo stepped closer, invading her space, the scent of expensive cologne and gun oil. My son just smiled. He hasn't smiled in over a year. "Who are you, really?" "I studied audiology before life got complicated," Nancy said quietly. "My little brother was born deaf. I used to carry this fork to calm him down when things got too loud. It's just physics, Mr. Costello. Vibration is sound. You just have to deliver it differently." Pablo stared at her for a long moment, wheels turning behind his eyes. He reached into his jacket. The bodyguards shifted. Nancy held her breath. He pulled out a business card, black, with nothing but a phone number in gold embossing. "You finish your shift, then you leave through the front door. There'll be a car waiting."
"Sir, I have obligations. I can't just—" "You had a job serving food to tourists," Pablo interrupted. "Now you have a job helping my son. The car will be there. Don't make me ask twice." It wasn't a request. Nancy knew that. As Pablo sat back down, picking up the menu with shaking hands, Nancy realized her life had just changed forever. She'd walked into the lion's den, pulled a thorn from his cub's paw, and now the lion wasn't going to let her leave. The alley behind Gabriella's smelled like garbage and rain. Nancy stood by the service exit at 11:30 p.m., clutching her purse. Kevin had practically shoved her out, pressing an envelope of cash into her hand. "Good luck, Nancy. Don't look back." He'd looked at her like she was already gone. A black SUV idled at the curb, windows tinted black as midnight. The back door opened. A massive man with a scar through his eyebrow stepped out. "Miss Walsh, Mr. Costello is waiting." "I need to go home first," Nancy stammered. "I have a cat. I have bills." "Your rent's been paid for the year. The cat's being picked up by a service and brought to the estate. Get in." Nancy's blood went cold. In 2 hours, they'd found her apartment, paid her landlord, and essentially kidnapped her cat. She got in the car. The interior smelled of leather. Pablo Costello sat on the far side, reading something on a tablet. He didn't look up as she slid in. The door slammed shut. The car pulled into traffic. "You studied at NYU for 2 years, Pablo said, not looking up. "Speech pathology and audiology. Dropped out when your mother got sick. She died 6 months later. You have $60,000 in medical debt." Nancy stared. "How do you know that?" Pablo finally looked at her, his face half in shadow. "I know everything about people who get near my son. You're clean. No arrests, no habits. Just poor and stuck." "I'm not stuck. I'm surviving." "Same thing in this city." Pablo tapped the partition. The driver accelerated toward the George Washington Bridge. "My son, Vito. The doctors said his auditory nerve is completely severed. They wanted to try a cochlear implant, but the surgery had risks, facial paralysis, brain damage. I refused." "That was reasonable," Nancy heard herself say. "Implants aren't magic. If he's not a candidate, forcing it could traumatize him more." Pablo's eyes narrowed. "Everyone else told me I was being stubborn, that I was denying him a normal life." "Normal is overrated," Nancy said. "You don't need to fix him, you need to reach him." Pablo fell silent, looking out at the dark river below. His mother died in childbirth, complications. She was a concert violinist, loved music. He paused.
Feels like God's joke that her son would never hear a note. Nancy softened. I'm sorry.
The vulnerability vanished. Pablo straightened. You'll live at my estate in Alpine. You'll be Vito's teacher. You'll teach him to communicate. You'll teach me to communicate with him. In return, your debt disappears. You'll make $12,000 a month, and you'll sign an NDA that says if you ever talk about my business, my home, or my people, you won't talk again. Clear? Nancy swallowed. The money was life-changing, but the cost was her freedom. And if I say no? Pablo turned to her, his eyes dark and unreadable. We're already crossing the bridge, Nancy. You're already in. The car sped into the night, leaving the lights of Manhattan behind, heading toward the cliffs of Alpine, New Jersey, where Pablo Costello's estate waited like a fortress in the dark. The Costello estate wasn't a house, it was a compound. High stone walls topped with cameras, iron gates that opened with a mechanical groan. The mansion itself was gray stone and sharp angles, beautiful and forbidding in equal measure. Nancy was shown to her room by an older housekeeper named Noemi Reeves, a stern woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun. The room was luxurious, king bed, silk sheets, a balcony overlooking the Hudson, but Nancy barely noticed. Where's Vito? Master Vito is in the East Wing, Noemi said, setting down towels. Mr. Costello said you start tomorrow. I start now. Nancy grabbed her bag, which still contained the tuning fork, and walked out before Noemi could protest. She found the East Wing by following the silence. The rest of the house hummed with activity, phones ringing, footsteps, low voices, but the East Wing was dead quiet. Nancy pushed open a heavy door. The room was massive, filled with expensive toys. A train set circled the perimeter. A robotic dinosaur sat in the corner. A massive TV played cartoons with no sound. Vito sat in the middle of the floor, surrounded by Lego bricks. He wasn't building, he was clicking 2 bricks together over and over, feeling the snap in his fingers. Nancy stepped inside and closed the door. The vibration made Vito pause. He didn't turn, but he stiffened. He knew someone was there. Nancy took off her shoes. She wanted to feel the floor like he did. She walked heavily. Thump, thump, thump. Vito turned. His eyes widened when he saw her. The lady with the magic fork. Nancy smiled and sat on the floor, cross-legged, about 5 feet away. She didn't wave, she waited. Vito watched her carefully. He held up a red Lego brick, as if to say, "See this?" Nancy reached into her bag. She didn't pull out the fork this time. She pulled out a balloon she'd grabbed from the restaurant's party supply closet. She blew it up and tied it off. She placed the balloon on the floor and tapped it lightly. It bounced. Then Nancy pulled out her phone, turned the volume to maximum, and placed it against the balloon. She played a song with heavy bass. She gestured to Vito. Vito crawled forward, hesitant. He reached out and touched the balloon. His face exploded with joy. The balloon amplified the vibrations. He could feel the beat, the rhythm, the music vibrating against his fingertips in high definition.
He laughed, a breathless, delighted sound. He looked at Nancy like she'd handed him the universe. "What are you doing?" The voice came from the doorway. Pablo stood there, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, holding a glass of whiskey. He looked exhausted. "I'm showing him music," Nancy said. "He can't hear the melody, but he can feel the rhythm." Pablo walked into the room. He looked at his son, who was now hugging the balloon, eyes closed, swaying. "I bought him a grand piano. I bought him speakers that cost more than a car. And you make him happy with a balloon?" "Money doesn't buy physics," Nancy said gently.
He doesn't need expensive equipment. He needs someone who understands how he experiences the world. Pablo sat down on the floor. It was surreal. The head of a crime family sitting cross-legged on a rug. "Show me." Nancy handed him the balloon. "Hold it. Close your eyes." Pablo hesitated, then did. Nancy turned up the music. Pablo sat there, feeling the rhythm vibrate through the rubber. He opened his eyes and looked at Vito. Slowly, he extended the balloon toward his son. Vito reached out. They both held it, the vibration passing between them, connecting them. Vito looked up at his father's face. He reached out a small hand and touched Pablo's cheek. Pablo froze, eyes wide. Vito had never done that before. "He's curious," Nancy whispered. "The vibration makes him feel safe. When he feels safe, he reaches out." Pablo looked at Nancy, his dark eyes intense. There was something there. Gratitude, fascination, maybe something more. "You stay. Whatever you need, you get it. Fix this." "I can't fix his ears," Nancy said softly, "but I can build a bridge between you." Pablo stared at his son, who was now calm, tracing the grain of the wooden floor. "That's all I want, the bridge." Suddenly, heavy footsteps pounded down the hall. A man appeared in the doorway. Luca, the driver. "Boss, we've got a problem. The shipment at the port. The Russians hid it. They knew the route." The father vanished. The crime lord returned. Pablo's face hardened to stone. He stood, checking a pistol from a holster at his back. "Stay here. Don't open the door for anyone but me or Luca." "What's happening?" Nancy asked, heart racing. "Welcome to the family, Nancy," Pablo said, and walked out. Nancy sat alone with Vito, clutching the balloon, realizing the walls of this fortress weren't built to keep danger out. They were built to keep the war from getting in, and she was now inside. 3 weeks passed. Pablo returned that night with blood on his shirt and wouldn't talk about it. Nancy focused on Vito. The progress was staggering. She taught him modified ASL, using tactile signs he could feel on her hands before copying them. Within days, he had a vocabulary: father, home, hungry, happy. Pablo watched from doorways, never entering, as if afraid he'd break the magic. But one evening, Nancy gestured to him. "Come here."
Pablo walked in. Vito saw him and ran over. He grabbed Pablo's hand and placed it on his own throat. Then Vito hummed, a low vibration. He wanted Pablo to feel his voice. Pablo knelt, placing his rough hand on Vito's small throat. He felt the hum. Tears welled in his eyes, though he blinked them back. "I want to take him out," Pablo said. "The botanical gardens in the Bronx. Private access. Just us." "Is it safe?" Nancy asked. "I have 20 men securing it. It's safer than here." The Bronx Botanical Gardens were a paradise of green and color. The entire conservatory had been rented out, empty except for Costello security. Vito was in heaven, running from flower to flower, touching petals, his eyes wide. Pablo walked beside Nancy, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the tree line. "He looks normal, like any other kid." "He is normal," Nancy corrected. "He just sees the world differently." Pablo stopped walking. He turned to Nancy. "You've changed everything. You saved him. Maybe you saved me, too." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering. "Nancy." She leaned into his touch. "Pablo." Suddenly, Vito stopped running. He was standing by a large glass partition separating the tropical room from the desert room. He pressed his face to the glass, frowning. Then he saw something, a flash of light in the reflection, a rhythmic glint, like a tiny star winking. Vito didn't know what a sniper scope looked like, but he knew patterns, he knew light.
He turned and waved frantically at Nancy, signing the words she'd taught him for danger. Then he pointed at the glass. Nancy looked. She saw the glint. "Pablo, get down!" She didn't think. She tackled Vito to the ground, covering his body with her own. Crack! The sound of a high-powered rifle shattered the tranquility. The glass pane next to Pablo's head exploded. If Nancy hadn't screamed, if Pablo hadn't turned, his blood would have been on the orchids. "Sniper!" Pablo roared, pulling his gun. Chaos erupted. 2 more shots hit the ground near Nancy's feet. Pablo grabbed Nancy and Vito by their collars and dragged them behind a concrete planter. "Stay down!" Pablo fired toward the upper ridge. Vito was crying, feeling the terrifying vibrations of gunfire. Nancy struck her tuning fork and pressed it to Vito's chest. The pure hum calmed him slightly. Pablo's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "The anchor is the boy. Cut the anchor. The ship sails free. V." Pablo went white. Vinny, his cousin, his underboss, the man running security at the gate. He thinks if Vito dies, I'll be free to lead without distraction. "We have to move," Nancy said, spotting movement above. "No." Pablo stood, fully exposed. "You run. Take Vito to the service exit. Luca's there. Run, Nancy." Nancy grabbed Vito and sprinted. She didn't look back at the gunfire. She ran for the boy's life, while behind her, Pablo Costello stayed to settle family business. Luca's SUV screeched to the service exit. Nancy threw herself into the back seat with Vito. "Where's Pablo?" she screamed. "He's cleaning up the mess," Luca shouted, flooring it. "If he dies a boss. If the boy dies, it all ends."
Nancy pulled out her tuning fork, striking it and pressing it to Vito's chest. The vibration steadied him. He looked up at her, signing, "Dad?" Nancy kissed his forehead, tears streaming down her face. Back in the shattered palm house, Pablo moved through the foliage. "Vinny, come out!" Vinny's voice echoed from above. "You know I'm right, Dante. A death boss, it ends the line. I did this for you." Pablo stepped into the open, arms spread. "Take the shot, Vinny. If you care so much, kill me and take the crown." Vinny hesitated. His rifle clicked, jammed. "You never checked your gear," Pablo said coldly. "You relied on noise. You never learned to listen." Pablo raised his pistol. 1 shot. Vinny fell. Pablo turned and walked out. He had a family to get to. 4 hours later, at a safe house overlooking the Atlantic, Pablo walked through the door. Nancy ran to him. He pulled her into a crushing embrace. "It's over," he murmured. "He's gone. I thought you weren't coming back." Pablo cupped her face. "I couldn't leave him. I couldn't leave you. I'm just the teacher. No, you're the reason I can hear my son." He kissed her. A rhythmic thump sounded. Vito was standing there, stomping his foot. He pointed to Pablo, then Nancy, then hooked his fingers together, connected. Pablo laughed and scooped Vito up, pulling Nancy in. Yes, connected. 6 months later, at Carnegie Hall, the stage lights dimmed. Pablo stood at the podium. "Many of you ask about my legacy. Meet him." Vito walked out in a tuxedo, 7 years old now, confident. He walked to a grand piano center stage. The audience murmured, "A deaf boy at a piano?" Vito sat, placed his bare feet on the pedals to feel the reverb, and closed his eyes. He began to play. It wasn't Mozart. It was raw, percussive, alive. He slammed the bass keys, feeling the vibrations shake his body. He fluttered the high notes, feeling the sharp staccato in his fingers. He was playing the storm, the tuning fork, his father's heartbeat. The crowd was spellbound. When Vito struck the final note, letting it fade, he stood and turned. The room erupted. Men who'd killed for money were wiping their eyes. Vito couldn't hear the applause, but he felt the floor shaking. He saw everyone standing.
He looked to the side. Nancy was there, crying, signing, "Proud of you." Pablo walked out, placing a hand on Vito's shoulder. The Costello family doesn't listen to the world's noise. We make our own sound. He took Nancy's hand on one side, Vito's on the other. The crime lord, the teacher, and the boy who lived in silence stood together. Pablo had stopped trying to fix his son, and in doing so, his son had fixed him. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of love. And that's the incredible true story of how a simple tuning fork and a brave waitress changed one of New York's most powerful families forever. It reminds us that the people we think are broken are often just speaking a language we haven't learned yet. Pablo thought he needed to cure Vito's silence. What he really needed was to learn how to listen to it. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs hope today. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. What would you have done in Nancy's place? Tell me in the comments. Thanks for watching.